As I lay slumped in one corner of the cell, I was amazed at the efficiency in shutting out all the light. I couldn't see anything, and I became disoriented. As the hours passed, I moved about the room on my knees looking for an opening. Only a tiny pencil-sized beam of light filtered through a somehow overlooked crack near the bottom of the floor. In the following days and nights, that tiny beam would become my friend, a link with the outside, and a point of reference for my orientation. I could see it only when within a foot of it, but I visited it regularly and spoke to it as though it were a person. These were the memories of Jeremiah A. Denton, one of the most famous prisoners of the Vietnam War, recounting his harrowing days in captivity. Similar or even worse fates were suffered by hundreds of American soldiers, Marines, and pilots who had the misfortune of being captured by the Vietcong and North Vietnamese. In dozens of POW camps spread throughout Vietnam, they endured unspeakable horrors, conditions so deplorable they were unfit for animals, and tortures beyond the realm of what the normal mind could imagine. This is their story. The worst fate for an American GI in Vietnam was undoubtedly captivity in one of the enemy's camps. Indeed, most men would have preferred a quick end rather than being captured by the Viet Cong. However, those who were captured preferred to be anywhere but in one of the POW camps in the South. These places were true hell on earth. The distinctive feature of the POW camps in South Vietnam was that the prisoners were not housed in buildings but confined within primitive shelters. Typically simple bamboo cages, these confinements were intentionally designed to inflict misery on their inmates. They were too short to allow a prisoner to stand upright, and just long enough to accommodate a hard bamboo bed. That was if you were lucky to have a bed, as in some camps, prisoners were forced to sleep directly on the ground. To make things worse, prisoners were kept isolated in individual cages without a direct view of other prisoners. Camps were typically located deep in the jungles, where almost no direct sunlight reached the ground. However, the lack of sunlight seemed like a minor issue when the monsoon season arrived. During this period, prisoners were completely exposed to heavy rainfall, which severely impacted their physical and mental health. Furthermore, the ground where they slept and spent their days turned into mud. Mixed with prisoners' body waste, it became a breeding ground for various diseases. Prisoners suffered from dysentery, malaria, fungal infections, and were constantly tormented by rats, leeches, snakes, scorpions, ants, and mosquitoes. Such dire living conditions in South Vietnamese POW camps were captured by sarcastic nicknames given by American prisoners. Camps located in the swamps of the Mekong Delta were dubbed the Mangrove Hotel, Neverglades, or Mosquito Junction. Those in the northwestern part of the country were referred to as Sing Sing, Auschwitz, or Dachau. As if the terrible living conditions within POW camps were not enough, American prisoners were subjected to brutal daily treatment. It was not unusual for prisoners to be forced to spend the entire day with their hands tied behind their backs as a punitive measure for misbehavior. For more severe offenses, the punishment was harsher. Prisoners would spend days shackled in their cages, lying in their own urine and feces. Additionally, beatings were a routine procedure. Interestingly, prisoners held in southern POW camps were not subjected to other forms of torture. This was likely because the beatings and the harsh outdoor environment were deemed severe enough. Serious malnutrition was another form of this brutal treatment. The standard diet in southern POW camps consisted of 2 or 3 cups of rice per day. Often transported from distant farms and stored for long periods, this rice was usually rotten and infested with insects and rat feces. Occasionally, the rice meals were supplemented with vegetables, typically grown by the prisoners themselves in camp gardens. During their time in the camps, prisoners were recorded to have lost up to half of their body weight. Such an unhealthy diet further exacerbated the prisoners' health issues. Beriberi, scurvy, bleeding gums, and tooth loss were just some of the consequences of malnutrition. Particularly dangerous was a condition known as osteomalacia, the softening of bones caused by a lack of calcium. Additionally, injuries from beatings almost always led to serious infections. as the Vietcong denied prisoners even basic medical care. Those who were very ill were likely to be killed. Indeed, POW camps in South Vietnam were a living nightmare, arguably the harshest conditions an American prisoner of war could endure. In this respect, these camps were undoubtedly more dire than those in North Vietnam. However, the camps in the North presented a completely different dimension of misery. POW camps in North Vietnam were marked by isolation, discomfort, and particularly severe methods of torture. There were at least 14 established camps in the communist-governed part of Vietnam, most located near Hanoi. Many of these camps housed not only American POWs, but also civilian prisoners from South and North Vietnam, as well as Laos. A significant number of the American detainees were pilots, shot down during bombing missions targeting North Vietnam. It's important to note that the government in Hanoi did not recognize these Americans as prisoners of war, as the United States had never officially declared war on North Vietnam. Instead, they were classified as political prisoners, and thus the provisions of the Geneva Accords did not apply to them. In practice, this meant that the North Vietnamese authorities had complete control over their fate. Like their counterparts in the South, the northern camps were also given evocative names by American prisoners: Alcatraz, Camp Faith, Camp Hope, Skid Row, and the Zoo. Among these, however, the most infamous was the Ho Lo prison, better known as the Hanoi Hilton. Hanoi Hilton became synonymous with the horrors endured by American POWs during the Vietnam War. The prison was a complex consisting of several compounds, each notable for its distinct cell structure and living conditions. One such compound, Heartbreak Hotel, featured tiny cells more akin to closets than living spaces. Little Vegas, in contrast, was reserved for higher-ranking officers. Cells within the Hanoi Hilton were rudimentary, characterized by high brick walls with small vent holes at the top, allowing only minimal air circulation. Cells typically measured 2 meters by 2 meters, though sizes varied slightly. Some were larger, but many were designed to significantly restrict movement and comfort. Often, these cramped cells housed multiple prisoners, drastically reducing the space available per person. The only furnishings included a wooden pallet or cement platform for a bed and a latrine bucket. A small wattage bulb lightened the cell 24 hours a day to add to the overall lack of comfort within the cell. What cells didn't lack were rats, cockroaches, mosquitoes, and extreme temperatures, more than 120 degrees in the summer and as low as 40 degrees in the winter. Upon arrival, POWs were issued a standard set of supplies: underwear, pajamas, sandals, a cotton blanket, a mosquito net, a toothbrush, a water jug, soap, coarse toilet paper, a straw mat, and the aforementioned waste bucket. This issue was one time only, despite some prisoners spending years in captivity. Misbehavior could result in the confiscation of these items. Although the living conditions in Hanoi Hilton cells were not as harsh as those in bamboo cages, they were utterly inhumane, filthy, and permeated by the stench of urine and feces mixed with stale air. Such conditions were not only physically uncomfortable, but also psychologically challenging. To aggravate the mental strain, prisoners were prohibited from communicating with each other. Isolation was the initial form of torture faced by prisoners at Hanoi Hilton. It aimed to break their spirits and impede any collective organization or resistance. Contact with the outside world was extremely limited, with prisoners' only interaction being with guards or during hostile and abusive interrogations, deepening their sense of isolation and helplessness. Prolonged periods of isolation they were exposed to led to significant psychological issues, including depression, anxiety, and disorientation. To further strip them of their dignity, prisoners were often paraded in front of large, hostile crowds, subjected to scorn and physical attacks. They endured kicks and had objects thrown at them, intensifying feelings of powerlessness, shame, and isolation. Even the diet was designed to dehumanize prisoners. Daily meals consisted of greasy vegetable soup and poor quality rice, deliberately contaminated with dirt and gravel to prevent damage to teeth. When punished, the vegetables provided to the prisoners sometimes bore traces of excrement used as fertilizer. occasionally issued bread was almost always infested with bugs and rat feces. Clean drinking water was a treat that prisoners received very, very rarely. The awful truth was that prisoners considered themselves lucky to eat at all. Very often, prisoners were denied food either as a punitive measure or just as a means of torture. Jeremiah A. Denton, one of the POWs from Hanoi Hilton, recalls in his book When Hell Was in Session how he went 3 days and nights without food or water as prison interrogators tried to starve a confession out of him. On the second night, he began hallucinating. Knobs on the walls turned into images of screaming devils and angels playing harps. In this agony, Jeremiah was certain only of one thing, that he would rather die of starvation than succumb to interrogators. Resisting such torture proved to be incredibly challenging as it could last for days. One common method of prolonged torture involved locking the prisoner's ankles in stocks at the bottom of the bed. These stocks often clamped down to the bone, causing tearing and laceration of the flesh. To further the prisoner's misery, his hands were tied behind his back, preventing him from lying down to sleep. Consequently, when the prisoner inevitably fell asleep, he would collapse backward onto his arms, and the pain from the handcuffs and ankle stocks would jolt him awake. If the guards wished to intensify the suffering, they would pass a rope from the prisoner's wrist over his head to his ankles, pulling him forward until his face pressed against his legs. It was not uncommon for prisoners to spend weeks or even months sitting upright with their legs extended in front of them, all the while as rats and bugs crawled all over them. During this time, they would urinate and defecate on themselves, exacerbating their already dire conditions. Once released from the leg irons, prisoners often faced the next phase of torture, severe beatings. Prison guards, either individually or in groups, would enter the cell and brutally assault the prisoner, breaking noses, teeth, and ribs. Some guards preferred to use bamboo sticks or rubber whips for flogging. When guards wished to intensify their punishment, they would transfer the prisoner to a torture cell, where the prisoner would be seated on a stool and the beatings would continue. Whenever they noticed the prisoner nearing unconsciousness, they would pause, allowing him a minute or two to regain consciousness before resuming. If beatings did not yield the desired results, guards and interrogators resorted to the notorious rope trick. This technique involved tightly binding the prisoner's arms from shoulders to elbows. Then, both arms were tied together until the elbows touched. Within about 10 minutes, the prisoner would experience overwhelming pain in his arms and shoulders. As blood circulation was cut off, the arms would swell, sometimes to twice their normal size. Eventually, the pain would diminish as the prisoner's limbs went numb. The ropes would then be loosened, allowing blood to flow back into the arms, which caused excruciating pain. A variation of this torturous method involved tying the prisoner's wrists to a hook on the ceiling. Once hoisted off the ground and left hanging, the prisoner would suffer from dislocated shoulders. In addition to the inhumane and barbaric treatment already described, POWs were subjected to further torture through forced postures. They were made to kneel or stand in uncomfortable positions for days at a time, sometimes with sticks placed behind their knees to intensify the pain. On other occasions, prisoners were forced to hold their arms aloft for prolonged periods. If their arms dropped, they were beaten. These tortures were employed to extract valuable information or to coerce prisoners into cooperation, such as writing statements condemning American involvement in the Vietnam War. Those who refused to comply were pushed to the very limits of their endurance. Persistent resistors faced extreme isolation. They were confined to solitary cells devoid of ventilation, light, and even a waste bucket. In these dark, isolated conditions, prisoners could spend months overwhelmed by dirt, the stench of their own feces, and a profound sense of despair. The tortures endured by American POWs left deep and enduring marks on those who survived. The impacts were both physical and psychological, stretching long into the lives of these prisoners even after their return home. The immediate effects of the torture were brutal. Prisoners sustained severe physical injuries, including broken limbs, dislocated joints, and internal organ damage. But the pain didn't end with their release. Many former POWs continued to battle chronic pain and disabilities that arose from the physical torture and the dreadful living conditions they endured for years. Mentally, the scars were just as severe. Many of the POWs suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. These mental health issues often lasted for decades, impacting how veterans managed their emotions, interacted socially, and integrated back into civilian life. Despite these challenges, a notable number of POWs showed remarkable resilience. During their captivity, they developed coping strategies like using tapping codes for communication and maintaining a structured chain of command, which provided them with a sense of unity and purpose amidst the chaos. Thanks only to their magnificent resilience, hundreds of American prisoners of war survived this hell and returned home. However, the return to normal life was a new battle they had to fight. Reconnecting with families and friends was a true challenge. After years apart, compounded by the trauma of war and the harsh realities of Vietnamese camps, rebuilding these personal relationships was a painstaking process for many. Unfortunately, as per the report of the American Ex-Prisoner of War Organization, 114 out of 772 confirmed POWs never lived to see their families again. They left their bones in the cages and dungeons of the Vietnamese camps. Their story will forever stand as a memory of the brutal reality of the Vietnam War and the enduring spirit of those who survived it. Thank you for watching this episode. Let us know your thoughts on torture during the Vietnam War in the comments. Hit the bell icon to be notified of what's next. Stay tuned.